I'm here with Ashton, and this is an auspicious occasion because for I would think about maybe 3, 4 years. We now live in the Western Cape. We've been threatening to. We have these meetings. We get together and we just chat about things that really interest us, and the things that connect Ashton and myself together is that we both have a business partnership. We've been together in businesses. Ashton has got great skills in strategy and loves working on strategies and learning about it. And I've got an entrepreneurial background, and so we love to talk about business. But the thing that we have in common is this commitment and this belief in the spiritual Christian spiritual principles and how they often influence and have made a difference in the way that we've applied them to business. So we just love talking about that. So we thought we'd record some of these conversations, and maybe somebody else would be interested.
Yeah, maybe somebody else also thinks it's interesting to hear
What we've got to
random
say, because
thoughts
like mostly it's people at the other table in the restaurant who must think, what are these guys on about? Because we interrupt each other and we get so excited about these things. But I think at the end of the day, it's for us to influence each other. And if it influences other people, that would be amazing.
I agree. Yeah, I think it would be. I think I walk away from these conversations always, firstly, inspired. And secondly, I would often arrive with an idea that I think I've thought through. And then the moment we actually start discussing it, then Matt, you bring on all sorts of thoughts to that.
Yeah.
And I walk away, and it's like this one idea that I had has become a fully fledged concept. And then, as you say, grounding it back into the way that we think about the spiritual life. And I think one of the things we definitely have in common is this idea that spirituality and God sits at the center of everything. And that if you do not have that proper spiritual meaning underneath what you're doing, you are probably, even though you think you understand what something is and why it exists, you're probably missing the core of the actual purpose and the meaning that sits behind it. And that is, as you say, we've discovered those things in the course of our lives, even as we've grappled with business and with real life issues. And we've both been through life for a few years now.
We still think we're young and learning, but the hair is betraying us at the moment.
It is, yeah. But learning, we definitely are. So, and hopefully we can help other people.
So I agree with you completely. So I thought to get things going in our first podcast together, is, for years, Ashton has had this 5 to 50 vision, and it's a vision that he has. Well, he'll explain itself, but it's all I can say is it's like going to Mars. It's like going to the moon. And I'm a great visionary. I'm a business guy who loves to have vision. I believe the early days, all I ever talked about was vision. But man, this vision has blown my mind, and I probably haven't been the kind of inspiration he would need from a friend in respect. And I thought about 5 or 6 years ago he'd given up on it because, through COVID and everything that was going on with COVID, I didn't think it was possible. But here you are, and you've got to a stage in your life, Ashton, where you want to actually like double down on 5 to 50. So tell us a little bit about what is 5 to 50, and just brief overview and why it is an inspiration for you.
Yeah, so as you rightly say, Matt, this has been my vision, my dream, pretty much for my whole life. So it started off with in my youth, actually. We are Generation X, and I was actively involved in various church movements at the time. And there was a lot of people that spoke about how Gen X was going to be the generation that's going to change the world, and there's going to be massive impact. And through that, over time, I began to really believe that it is possible in our generation to eradicate poverty as we know it. And I specifically started using the word eradicate, as opposed to, at that point in time, a lot of people were talking about alleviating poverty.
Yeah.
And I believed that it is possible to eradicate poverty. I have since then always held on to this vision that it's possible, but for most of my life, I had no idea even where to start. But what I did do is I did a lot of reading about, how the nonprofit world works, how the for-profit world works, what has driven economic growth in places like Europe and the US and China and Japan and Singapore over the years. And I've read a lot about what's going on in Africa and how poverty is sometimes architected. Mbeki wrote that book, Architects of Poverty, which really got me thinking. And then in 2016, roundabout there, we were still living in China at the time, and I began to have this idea of 5 to 50. So all this thinking came together to the point where I realized firstly, non-profits is not the answer. And I'm grateful for every non-profit and every cent of aid that has flown into Africa over the years. I'm deeply grateful for that. But what I came to realize is if we're going to eradicate poverty, it has to be done through a process of creating sustainable, good jobs through business. And then what I looked at was the different sizes of business, the niches that you can move around in. I realized there's a lot of focus actually on startups, but startup failure rate is incredibly high, especially when you're already operating in a difficult economic environment. And big businesses are great for creating stability, but big businesses typically employ when the economy is good and retrench when the economy is bad. So they just go through cycles that pretty much follow the economic cycles. And so I ended up settling on this idea of businesses of at least 5 people that have been running for at least 5 years. So they've crossed that first really hard time.
Whether they're actually going to be a business. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And employing 5 people, that may sound like little to those of you who are like hardcore entrepreneurs who built big businesses. But actually building a business from 0 to 5 and running it for 5 years and maintaining a payroll for 5 years.
Yeah, well, I always say that there actually is the difference between, you talk about farmers that are like sort of sustaining, self-sustaining, subsistence type farmer.
Yeah.
You can employ, many people can employ themselves, but to move from employing yourself to actually taking care of 4 other people is a huge achievement. So you're starting from that 5. So they've got through that sort of making sure it's a sustainable business phase, and then you want to get them to 50.
So that's the whole idea, is getting businesses like that and inspiring them, equipping them, and helping them to grow from 5 to 50. And that's the name of the business, 5 to 50. And initially, I did it on a consulting basis, and that actually we had some success. We saw some businesses grow. I'm a strategist, as you pointed out, so that's pretty much where I focused, help them formulate a 5-year strategy to grow them.
And I mean, that is a difficult thing to do. I mean, we refer to that, as an entrepreneur, people who invest in small businesses, as crossing the chasm, they're getting from that small to medium-sized business, which has a real contribution. 50 people is a contribution to any community.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that really changed to allow that to happen? This is a huge topic, but what's happening?
So maybe in a nutshell, if I can say that what I identified is that most of those businesses, you can sort of see it as a vicious triangle that they're stuck in. Most of those entrepreneurs are working incredibly hard. They're working 8, 10, 12 hours a day, often 5, 6, 7 days a week. They've got no time on hand to think about, how do I scale this business? How do I grow this business? Then the other leg of the triangle I found was that they typically are financially struggling. So they're typically running from payroll to payroll, often running overdrafts on the max most of the time. So they struggle with capital to bring any growth. And then just the skill of knowing, many of them are first-time entrepreneurs. Many of them have maybe come even out of the corporate world, but you can come with a lot of corporate skills. You can have an MBA. The ability to think 5 years ahead and say, what will my business look like in 5 years' time with 50 people, and then reverse engineer that back to where I am today, is actually not that easy. You could Google it and you'll get 1 million results in 0.3 seconds, but which one of those 1 million results is the one that gives you the information that you need? And so I found that people are really stuck in those 3 traps. And 5 to 50 is really built around understanding that and saying, how do we bring curated content that is focused on the type of challenges that you face? How do we help you to build a strategy like that? And then how do we bring capital into the space? And how do we create a community that you can connect with, a community of practice? So we've got, instead of the vicious evil triangle, we've built a positive triangle where we say curated content, a community of practice and accountability, and capital that can become available into this.
So there's 3 things you've mentioned to me that I think are worth mentioning that are part of that vision. So you've got obviously this idea that you're building a small to medium-sized business. And that is profitable. So it's, profit is a key thing. Yeah, we're not talking about, that's why you started by saying this isn't an for-profit, because you see profit as sustainability.
So, yes, absolutely. So profit actually, while we're on 3s, I set a generic goal for each one of those 3 businesses, or each one of those businesses, 3 generic goals.
Yeah.
and one of them is profit.
Yeah.
So we say that each one of these businesses, and I'm not going to go into the logic behind all of it now, but we ran the numbers to say, like, are these reasonable goals to set for these businesses? And the first goal is grow to 50 people. So obviously we're in Africa, we're a young continent.
Well, that's the second thing. It's about
so we're going to get there.
Yeah.
But on the profitability side, we're saying every business should get to at least a 10 million rand a year net profit.
So you've got to give a number there.
We've got that number, and the number is linked back to a business of 50 people. And it links back to then the third goal, which is free the founder.
Yeah. So so you jumped on me on the three goals because we got the profit, which we good. I just want to spend a bit of time on the other two because your second one is we'll come to the third one you mentioned as second. So free the founder was the other interesting thing because we're talking about, because what I'm trying to sort of differentiate is you're not just have a vision to grow businesses from small businesses to medium-sized businesses that have a much bigger impact on the economy and on employment, which we'll talk about specifically. You're also talking about certain elements. Obviously, they must be of a certain level of profit. We've dealt with that. And then you have this free the founder idea.
Yes.
Talk a bit about why that's so critical.
So the free the founder idea is really the last one that I added as I was beginning to think about what is happening with these small businesses and how they typically get stuck. And there's a lot of businesses that are lifestyle businesses where, people have built a little family business. They may be employing their 5 people or even 10 people. As they get older and they begin to try to say, well, how do we transition? The children may not necessarily want to run this business, and they realize they can't sell this business because they're locked into the business. And the business is dependent on that entrepreneur to run the business in order for it to have any value. So effectively, they've built an asset over their entire life, or they thought they've built an asset over their entire life. It has no value. So that's the one thing, is to make sure that the business actually has value. But then what I've discovered is once an entrepreneur begins to get free from their business, an amazing thing actually happens to the business because the entrepreneur is no longer in the day-to-day grind of the operations of that business, becomes a lot more strategic, thinks a lot more about the value that this business is creating in terms of shareholder value and future value. So that's the next one. Yeah. But the third one, which is what I'm really excited about when it comes to free the founder, is, I'm a big theory of constraints guy, right?
Absolutely.
And I've been thinking about what is the constraint in economic growth in a country. And I realized, I think the biggest constraint in economic growth, so just a quick definition, what is a constraint? It's the one thing that holds something back from moving faster or growing faster. And the constraint in a country's economy are founders, people who can start and grow businesses. Okay. Now, what happens is most of those founders get stuck in their first business.
Yeah, you need to get them out. There's another one going.
But when I talk to these founders, when I first meet with them, most of them have at least 5 ideas of new businesses that they'd love to start.
I haven't had that problem. I've kept moving.
Exactly, right? Like, that's where the concept of serial entrepreneurs come from. But now, if you're so stuck in that triangle of I've got no time, I've got no money, and I don't know how to grow my business, and you're not building an asset of value, you never get unstuck from that thing. So 5 or 6 or 7 businesses that could have been created are never created. Because you're stuck.
And for me, why I was emphasizing free the founder, I think for people listening to this, is that to be able to be free, there's so many things that have to go right in the business. There's a lot of, I'm a kind of entrepreneurial, creative guy, and therefore I like a lot of no structure. But it's actually the bringing in of certain structures that actually allows the founder to be free. So a lot of these things we've learned over time with business, like, a business with 5 or less employees won't have a board, for example. Why would you need a board?
Yeah.
But you actually need to have a board of directors if you're going to eventually free the founder.
Exactly.
And in the beginning, as a founder, the last thing I wanted to be is to have meetings with non-executive members that have some interest in my business. But, a lot of these structures were put in place over years and years of people learning how to run businesses.
Yeah.
And those are some of the things that actually would help the founder to get freed eventually.
Exactly. And that's putting those structures in place. So what we typically would do when I was doing this from a consulting perspective is we would start with, imagine today you have a business that's got 50 people. It's making 10 million rand a year net profit, and you're not running this business today. What does that look like?
Yeah.
And we reverse engineer that all the way back. So by that time, you would have a board, which you typically might be the chairman of.
Yeah.
But with other members that you have deep trust in, people that are really adding And then what would your exec layer look like? What would your management layer look like?
All
And
these
then
strategy stuff that you think you just learn about at university, and you think, oh well, what does that
it's
matter?
actually the reality of
I've
successful
just been through a
businesses.
journey. We talk about 5 to 50, how many years? But it's a journey with 10 years with the business in the UK. And when I joined the business, it was pretty much a family business. You had a brother and a brother-in-law who were the main founders, together with a very, very close friend from the church.
Yeah.
And it was a fairly successful business. They probably had about 7 or 8 employees, and they were running this business. And a part of my job was really to free the founders because they were getting on. I mean, the one guy was 63, and this business made good profit and paid them dividends. But the guy had to retire eventually, and then they wouldn't pay him a salary, and he probably would better to get his dividends. And so we spent really 5 or 6 years doing exactly what you're talking about. That's why I was so interested in that. And the good news is that, early this year, we were able to sell that business. And for two of them specifically who were dedicated to the business, the other one was part-time, that allowed them to take home their pension. Because they got a big payday, but they wouldn't have been able to do that 10 years ago because they were the business.
And that's exactly what happens. And that's why, you keep asking me about one goal at a time, but I can't separate them from each other because so the profitability is a key part of freeing that founder and also making capital available for that founder in terms of what they want to do next. Or if you want to sell the business, profitability is a key element in terms of value and showing that this business is independent of you. But the same with the 50 employees. If you've only got 5 employees and you want to employ a full-time manager, this person suddenly is, 50% of your payroll.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got 50 employees, you can employ a proper
now this is a
differentiator,
differentiator which I've often sort of pushed back on you, but I think it's a very important thing. Just give a bit more time as we sort of bring to a close this discussion on your amazing vision. And that is this 50, as it links to 50 employees. Because, as an entrepreneur, I think I was telling you this before, very often when you're building a business, well, certainly because people are often the biggest challenge. And I have a technology background, so, maybe there's bias there. You actually think, well, how big a business can I build in terms of the profitability, 10 million plus, with the least number of people, because people are the problem. But you're actually saying a measure of success in my movement is profitability, free the founder, but I want you to be employing people.
Absolutely.
And I think your reasoning behind that, living in Africa, living in South Africa, and generally just in terms of your worldview, I mean.
Absolutely. So yes. So I think the thing that I always have to come back with is the reason I'm doing this, remember, is because I want to eradicate poverty.
Which is that spiritual principle that we talk about.
Exactly. And I think we are moving into a time where the opportunity to build businesses that will be spectacularly profitable with 5 people is absolutely going to be there in the future. What I'm saying is that's not where I want to play in these last 20 or 30 or 50 years of my life, depending how long we're still going to be around. I want to play in the space where human beings and their lives are being changed and impacted, and we create. And we've got quite a nice definition for a good job, and we won't go into that today. But it's not just about creating jobs. It's about creating good jobs where people get dignity, meaning as well. And then, the big picture is we want to create 1 million jobs over the next 15 years. And
then in 50 years' time,
50,000 founders.
We're going to a stadium in Cape Town.
Yes, so that's the vision.
With these founders.
Yeah, so 2039, the 3rd of October, 2039, that's the vision.
Wow.
We will be getting together in the stadium in Sea Point, and there will be 50,000 founders who over these 15 years have gone through this program.
Sure.
So 50,000 founders who all love God and are passionate for what God is doing in Africa. Absolutely. Who all have a business or 2 or 3 maybe by that time that's doing 10 million rand a year net profit. And we're going to have a huge celebration, and then we're going to break up into groups all over Cape Town over the next week and have those people sit together and say, how do we eradicate poverty? We've now got this platform. Wow. We're generating 250 billion rand a year of net profit. How do we take that net profit and our skills and our ability and what we've learned over the last 15 years, and we eradicate poverty, firstly in Africa, and we hit the rest of the world. And before we die, in our generation still, we will see poverty as it is in the world today eradicated.
Wow. And that's an incredible vision. Just one last thing to add to, because we had chatted about it and I wanted to bring this home, is that why it's relevant here in Africa. Ashton was saying to me, when we have this discussion, let's be sort of Afro-optimist. We've all been through our kind of, very optimistic about Africa, then we get disappointed because it has a way of doing that to you. We've all lived generations in this continent. But I think one thing that Africa is doing differently is it's still pro-humanity. And we've got the highest growth rate and birth rate, and we've got to back humans in the future. And I think that's spiritually the right approach to take. God backed humans when he put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and we want to back humans. And so by you saying the measure of the success of a business, even for that founder, is not just that you got to the 10 million or you got to that freeing of yourself, but that you impacted 50 or more other people and their dependents for the rest of their lives. I mean, that's meaning, that's purpose.
That is meaning and purpose. Matthew, right now in South Africa, the unemployment rate of people between 18 and 35 is sitting at over 60%.
Wow.
Every second young person that you see on the street has no hope for a future, has no hope of getting a job.
Yeah. And that's not just a money issue, as you say.
By the time you get to 35 and you've never had a job, you're not going to get a job. Nobody's going to employ a 40-year-old who hasn't worked.
Yeah.
So it's a problem that we absolutely have to solve.
Yeah.
But it's also a problem which I believe we are at a point in history where there is actually enough resources for us to get this flywheel spinning. And then, as we all know, we've seen this. As much as there's this big anti-capitalist vibe out there at the moment in social media, etc., we have seen that the free market, with well-managed and well-meant and purpose-driven capitalism, is able to change the economy of a continent over less than a generation.
There's no other system that's done in terms of, even to this day, dealing with poverty, in bringing advancement to all sorts of fields than the free market economy.
Absolutely.
And bringing this back to how we always want these conversations to go, is that, to me, this idea of minimum regulation and maximum freedom is like the foundation of the biblical story. If you look back to the Genesis record, I mean, Adam and Eve are given the Garden of Eden, and the first kind of idea is freedom. God says to Adam, you may freely eat of all of the trees of the garden. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, oh, but hang on, there was one rule. Now, the thing is that you're talking about the theory of constraints. There is no such thing as freedom unless there is one constraint, because you can only understand freedom against its opposition, which is I can't. I can and I can't. And so God actually sets in place the minimum requirement in order for freedom to take place. And he says there's one rule: you may not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But the basis upon which he designed the structure of the Garden of Eden and designed us with free will is that we would operate best where there is freedom and almost no regulation.
Yes.
And I think that's from if you now then bring that into human government, where you have a human government that has a form of regulation, there has to be some form of regulation, but kept to the minimum so that the freedom can operate. That's where you're likely to get the growth that you're talking about. And so one of the challenges, we've spoken about this, is your model has to encourage that freedom, which I'm sure it will, all about that, and get people being creative, but also the economy that you operate in, and this is where it does become political, etc., needs to be as friendly as possible to those principles.
Yeah, and so that is very interesting that you touch on that. Just the other day, I was meeting with some friends of mine from Sweden, and we were going through this vision, and they were asking me, because they're very actively involved. They were actively involved. I don't know if you know, Sweden was actively involved in the end of apartheid.
Yes.
And Sweden has been very actively involved in South Africa and what we've done. And they were asking me, in terms of, so they obviously have a strong understanding of the impact of politics on what's happened in South Africa. And they said to me, am I able to influence some of the regulations that are at the moment, for example, in South Africa and other countries in Africa, often are not very market friendly?
No, not at all.
And I think my answer to that is, for one thing, is the more of these conversations we have, the better. Make sure that we bring good knowledge out into the open space. But the other is, hopefully, if I get to the point where we have 50,000 of these founders that are actively participating, then we are beginning to bring some pressure to bear on the powers that be to say, these are the kinds of environments in which we can be more
I
successful.
remember a story. I was listening to a podcast of a very successful American immigrant who had come from Uganda. It was a lady. She'd built a number of businesses over in the US, and she, decided to go back, as many people would, to Uganda to bring her skills and to try and encourage entrepreneurship and business, much like you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And she came back to Uganda, and in the podcast, she said what just basically blew her mind is she started to say, well, I need to set up a company. And it took her over 6 months in Uganda because of all the regulations, interference, corruption, all the different layers, in order for her to just do something she said in the US would have taken her 30 minutes online.
Yeah.
Now, if you can just imagine just that one difference in terms of being free to move on and being constrained completely by regulation and corruption, I should add other layers of things that come into play, you can see the difference.
Yeah.
And in South Africa, we always have this conversation about the three evils. It's poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And, for me, we want to then create a whole bunch of regulations to deal with inequality. Most of the regulations are trying to deal with inequality and therefore reducing the freedom for people to run the businesses as they want to run their businesses. Whereas of those three, if you can focus on the one that you're focusing on, which is unemployment, well, that will deal with poverty, not just poverty materially, poverty of the mind in terms of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And then actually inequality will be irrelevant. It will always be there. We've spoken about that before. But you see, it's too easy just to jump on that one and then lead to all the regulations that actually mean we don't have freedom. And if we don't have freedom, we don't have growth. If we don't have growth, we're not going to deal with unemployment. So I think you've got your finger on the right vision there, Ash, and I wish you all the best. And I'm definitely going to be a supporter. And if this podcast continues, I'm sure we're going to be following the journey and getting excited about developments.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and your support means a lot to me because I know you are quite critical of the things that you support.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's. But thank you.
No, great. So one of the things we thought we would move on to, and I'm going to segue this, is a topic that I've been very excited about this year. Like each year, I don't know whether you do the same, but I try and have a theme. I don't really have a New Year's resolution. Like I've learned that things have to happen much longer. I'm a strategist, so I have a 5-year or a 10-year vision. But I like to have a theme for the year.
Yeah.
What's my theme? What am I going to be really looking for? And I guess, and you don't sort of wake up on the 1st of January. It's something that's been moving in you. And so the word that kept coming up to me, towards the end of the year was this word inspiration. And we use it a lot. I mean, we've probably used it in this conversation already. And, you have this vision that's inspiring to me. I hear your vision. I think, wow, that's going to get you up in the morning, Ash, for another 35 years. That's what you need when you get into your 50s. What's going to get you up really excited? So it's inspiring. And we talk about inspiration, but I started thinking deeply about this word and how it could impact me in the year to come. So I thought we'd chat a bit about that, and hopefully that will inspire you further for your vision.
That sounds great.
The interesting thing, inspiration. If you had to look it up in the Oxford Dictionary, there are two ideas that, when you hear them, you think, oh, that makes a lot of sense, but they're really critical to understand the difference between inspiration and like motivation or drive. Now, both of them are required to make things happen, but we often talk about motivation, and motivation is this point where you kind of have a goal, you have a desire, and then there's this internal energy that drives you towards that desire. So at a very simple level, you wake up in the morning and you motivate it for the first cup of coffee. The goal is to get the cup of coffee. There's internal motivation, you get your body up, you stretch, you do whatever you need to do. You go downstairs or wherever your coffee machine is and you have your cup of coffee. Or it may be a far more kind of sort of a better goal than that. It may be to run the Comrades Marathon. And you have a goal and then you're motivated and you've got to wake up every morning and go training so that you can be ready to run the marathon. That's motivation. And a lot of what we do is driven by motivation. Yeah. The difference with inspiration is that the original influences are external, and therefore, by definition, inspiration is often associated with creativity. So you will see in the Oxford Dictionary this idea of an external influence that leads to creativity. And that's really what struck me, because if you think about this from a biblical perspective, and we always want to bring things back to these incredible principles, so many of them are in the first 4 chapters of Genesis. I hardly get out of there. You see, you don't need to read your own Bible, just read the first 4 chapters. You've got this idea of the first recorded inspiration. I mean, that's what the word is. You know, we have English words today we use glibly, but we don't think about their etymology, where they came from.
Yeah.
So the word inspiration basically means in spirit. In other words, to breathe the spirit in, to breathe the breath in. And so thinking about this external and creativity, you've got this idea in the Genesis record that you have this whole little bit of clay that's put together, you know, and this clay is the body of Adam. All right. And it's got all this potential, but none of that's going to happen until some external influence comes into it. And so the book of Genesis says God breathed into the nostrils and he became a living soul. He became a creature as we know it. And so that's the first inspiration.
So he was inspired to be alive.
He was inspired, and he was inspired by the most creative being. That's all we know about. The first thing we learn about God is that he's a creator. You know, the first thing we learn is that he creates. So he then externally influences, in other words, he inspires into Adam. Adam then becomes this living being, and he himself is a creator. That's his unique inheritance over and above any of the other creatures. You know, we can go into nature. I love going to the Kruger nature, and yes, at best you might see a nest that looks vaguely impressive made by a weaver. But, you know, if you want to see creativity, go down the road in any beautiful old city or everywhere and go into a museum or into an art gallery. You will see creativity because that's what we're born to do. But it is this external influence. And if you think about it logically, it's when you open yourself up to the external influence that's more likely to lead to something creative yourself. Yeah. Because when you're operating internally all the time, and we often do just operate, that's what motivation is doing. Yeah. We're going to be doing, when the inputs are the same, the outputs are going to be the same. And so we're going to do the same. We talk about doing the same tracks. We follow the same patterns. Yeah, yeah. And we look back on a year and say, well, why did we end up doing pretty much the same thing this year as we did last year? Where was the creativity? Where was that new thing that I did as Ashton or as Matthew? It's not there because we were not attuned to some external thing. So that's where my mind was going. Yeah. And why it's so impactful is because it's actually a way of being. And this isn't just, obviously, I'm coming from a Christian perspective, and you can imagine where this goes. It becomes how attuned and aware are you to become aligned to the Spirit? In other words, are you living a life and are you positioning yourself in a spirit of humility and in a spirit of sensitivity to the way in which the Spirit would work so that you can become in the Spirit, so that you can become inspired? Is that the way you've ordered your day? Is that the way you order your life? Is that the way you order your character? In order to be someone who can be inspired, to be externally influenced by God, and that will lead to creativity and abundance because that's the way he designed you to work. But that also works because any principle, here's something that we will repeat over and over again. Any principle that is divinely true as a principle is true in every other facet. That's why we love applying these principles to business. That's right. And so the same is true in business because our inspirations come from listening to others. If you know, and we may pretend to listen to others, we may pretend to have discussions, but all we want to do is speak ourselves or ask people advice, but we don't really want their advice. But the more we are truly open to hearing the external influence, the more opportunity we have to be creative.
Absolutely. That is, and that is so aligned with what we are busy trying to build.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I mentioned earlier, so we've got the two legs of content and community.
Yes, that community side, which is what I was thinking of.
Yes, opens you up to being inspired by. So one of the things that we've discovered in terms of that inspiration is that depending on where you are at, limits the type of inspiration you can receive and the inspiration you can put into action. Because that's the other thing. I think what a lot of us do is we get inspired by something, and especially I think guys like us, we are easily inspired. So you get inspired by a lot of
inspiration.
Yes, but then you can become a bit glazed in terms of inspiration that you go, oh, another good idea, another interesting. So you have to have a discipline whereby you actually filter through that inspiration. You go, what of that do I take into my life, or what of that do I apply? And so just one thing that we learned at one stage, I was running a business. You were an advisor to us in that business. And at that point in time, the previous business you had run was much, much further ahead than the one we were running. And we actually found that a lot of your advice we couldn't apply. It was great advice. We would walk around out here, super inspired. You'd get back to the office and we'd go like, wait. So how does that translate back to the fact that we don't have money in the bank at the end of the month? And so part of what we want to create is that community where you are dealing with people who are maybe just a little bit ahead of you.
Just that one.
Yes. Yeah. But then also holding each other accountable to what are you being inspired by, and then bring in content. So make sure that there's always good inspirational content available. But I absolutely, the other thing I was thinking of as you were speaking, Matt, is the opposite of inspiration, which I don't know what would be the word, but it comes in from the outside. But it absolutely drains your inspiration, which is scrolling through things that just don't
takes
align.
Away your creativity.
Yes, and
it robs you of the one thing that you were given to be.
Well, actually, two things: your creativity and your agency.
Yes,
because when you accept inspiration and you choose to take, so inspiration comes in, then I choose to take that inspiration and do something with it. As opposed to consuming creative content, which is typically of lower quality. And what it actually does is it removes the agency from it. The algorithm becomes the agent. The algorithm now says, I think this is what you want to have, so I'll keep feeding you, as opposed to me being.
And that's why we eventually believe that actually we're not needed. We become anti-species. We think, well, actually, then the computer can do everything, because why do you need the agent? The human agent's no longer required. And that's why that becomes
which brings us back to the whole pro-human of saying,
so
what is it that is absolutely human? So yes, AI is going to do things better than what we can. It's going to do all sorts of interesting things. But can an AI have this human experience of inspiration, of that experience of creativity that happens when the inspiration from the outside and something about who I am connects?
This is the beauty of this discussion. I haven't thought through a lot of these ideas, so they could be just useless, but they may be worth something. I want to add a layer that I think can give some grounding to the inspiration, and it'll bring me to a topic that you wanted me to talk a little bit about, which is synchronicity.
Yes.
So I think that in order for inspiration to be valuable, it needs to be in the context of meaning and purpose. So you actually were kind of saying that when you talked about the meaning and purpose, that inspiration would take context within the 5 to 50, because those individuals, they have a meaning that's established that they want to get their business to 50. They know where they are in the current context. And so the inspiration is within that context, and it's not some way out external influence that's saying, go into the Amazon jungle and look for some flying fish. That could be inspirational, but it doesn't sit within the context of where they're going. And I think this is absolutely critical. There's that beautiful verse that says, a man sets his goals, but God will direct his path. So God expects us to have purpose, to have meaning, to establish that. Obviously, it should be aligned to the kind of purpose and meaning that he's established, which is what he defines as good in Genesis 1, over and over again, what good is. And so we ought to be, I started my career as a great believer in vision and mission and purpose. And so we ought to have those. But the inspiration then is the context of that which is externally moving us creatively towards that purpose and towards a vision, and then ultimately continuing on in a purpose. And to me, why that's so interesting is because that brings me now to what is synchronicity. So synchronicity is related to all this, and maybe I can then make it really pragmatic how inspiration really impacts my life this year as a New Year's resolution thing. In May, we're talking about New Year's resolutions.
It's a theme for the year.
A theme for the year, absolutely. And it actually has really been probably my most impactful theme. So the thing about synchronicity is it's completely different. We'll move away completely from going to Genesis chapter 1 now, because it's actually, the word was coined by Carl Jung. And I've got quite into Carl Jung in the last sort of a year and a half, although saying that, it's like, saying you've got into quantum. The more you read, the less you understand. But Carl Jung is probably one of the most famous. Him and Sigmund Freud, I think, are the fathers of psychoanalysis. Yes. And but his approach is very different to Sigmund Freud. And Carl Jung always had this idea that there is this sort of corporate intelligence and
Mm-hmm.
design behind the world.
Yes.
And he talks about terms like the collective unconscious, etc. And one of the things that Carl Jung, if you haven't looked at any of his work, is he has this idea that we are essentially divided for a bunch of reasons. Our psyche's divided.
Yeah.
And one of the real meaning of life and the purpose of life he calls is individuation. In other words, seeking wholeness. How do you reconcile the divided parts of who you are?
Yeah.
And so we experience that. You know, everything's about reconciling. You know, in life there might just be trying to fix a puzzle. And then you reconcile it and you get that feeling of, I've taken divided things and made them whole. That's why puzzles are so popular.
Yeah.
It could be a relationship that's mended.
Yeah.
Or, you know, so you can just see this, you know,
Yes.
anecdotally, you can see he's onto something here. Anyway, in his studies, he discovered many, many occasions, and we know this is true, where he would have a patient who would come through and we'd describe a series of events that took place, that the only thing that connected those events was meaning. All right, so it would appear that you could not, you know, any events that we see in life, if we have a pure materialistic view of them, there's a cause and effect. So an event that takes place, I mean, this event of the cup hitting the table took place because of the cause of my hand putting it there, and that's how physics works. We study cause and effects. But what Carl Jung was discovering is there are too many things happening where you cannot see 4 or 5 events have happened and they are linked, but they're not linked by normal causal issues. So, for example, he gives the example, he was counseling a particular patient who was having an issue, and she was talking about this dream, and she was describing the dream, and she was describing this little bird, and it was a blue bird, and it had a yellow beak, etc. And, you know, she was going into the detail of the description of the dream, because Carl Jung takes dreams seriously, which you should do if you believe in inspiration. And while they're having this, there's this knocking on his window, knocking. He's irritated. He said, "Look, I know this is important. Please pause. I just got to see what's going on here." As he went to the window, and he was going to open the window, there was the exact bird that she had just described, this blue bird with the red beak, picking against the glass of the window. Now, this is a scientist. He's got no reason to make, and he said this is one of many stories. So there's no physical cause that you can say, well, she's telling the story about this exact bird, that bird would appear there. So he put this down to the fact that there is, and you know, far be it from us to get into all of Carl Jung's understanding, and I'm not going to just say that he was a proponent of Christianity, although he did have a Christian background, but he believed that there are events that take place that are only linked together through meaning. And they are very, very important for people to see and understand in their lives as a part of their journey towards wholeness, and to learn to be sensitized to them. And we know that. I mean, I think many of us, people listening or us chatting, you know, you've had times in your life where 3 or 4 things have happened. They just come together and you can't explain, why did I, you know, you might have, for example, been thinking about me. I might be thinking about you, Ashton. I thought, I must get hold of Ashton. 5 minutes later, the phone rings. It's Ashton.
Well, I have got a very good experience. An example of that. I mean, how long have we been speaking about getting onto podcasting?
Ridiculous.
And the day I got my microphone, I sent you that WhatsApp message and said, I just got myself a proper podcasting microphone. And you had just got yours that same week. So,
I mean, there was no communication.
And there's no cause and effect there. Exactly. I mean, the cause was we had conversations that could at any point in time have, and in fact, when I got my microphone, I had actually forgotten our conversations about podcasting.
Oh, wow.
How I got my microphone was my daughter wanted to start recording her music. So I reached out to a friend of mine and I said to him, my daughter wants to record music.
So you didn't know that the greater meaning was guiding that.
Yeah, and I then I thought, you know what, and I also want to maybe at some point get into podcasting. So I asked him, like, what would be a good microphone for both? But actually, so it was my daughter's question that triggered, but we ended up getting our microphones exactly the same week.
So that is a perfect example. And some of them are, I mean, in my life, I've had some huge ones. Sometimes it's just a small series of events, and you look and think, that like in a week, 3 or 4 people bring up the same topic to you. Now, what Carl Jung was saying is, so he termed this synchronicity. So a series of events that cannot be explained by normal cause and effect, but are linked together through meaning. And so I thought to myself, wow, that's really a powerful idea. And he was saying, look, a lot of people just brush this off as coincidence, chance, or you can say, hang on, what is it telling me about my meaning? What is the meaning that's actually being brought out through this? And how might that guide my behavior? How might that change the way I think about things? And so he also brought this to dreams. So, you can just think you're having a random dream, but then something happens the next day that actually even makes you remember the dream. And he would say, just stop now. When that moment happens, when you have a moment of synchronicity, take it seriously. It's a signpost on the journey of your own life, your own adventure to find this individuation, to find this wholeness. Now, let me bring this full string back to inspiration. So for me, it's like, I kind of understand the certain meanings that are important to me and the purposes that I'm challenged, that I'm moving towards. I make myself very sensitive towards synchronicity. That's one of the methods of inspiration. So pragmatically, what it's done for me is that, I kind of try and do with my wife our morning prayer. That's our kind of solid prayer where we pray for all the people that are important. And, we kind of do the prayer where you want to make sure you get through the checklist. You know what I mean? And then my evening prayer before I went to bed was always a prayer that to be honest, I didn't do a good job of. It's very personal. It's a personal prayer, but often would fall asleep because I would do it in bed. Confessions of a pathetic Christian. But I started, and this is before the end of this year, I started, getting on my knees and trying to do like a more, but then I realized like, actually, what I really need to do in that prayer is to open myself up to the synchronicities that God's brought into my life, to reflect on the day that has been, to say what actually happened in that day that might have moved, that might have risen up certain meaning, might have moved or been those voices towards something. So that's the first thing I try and do in that prayer. And then what I do is I ask God in the night to somehow order my thoughts or give me a dream or make me wake up with a greater clarity of what I might look for in the next day on that journey of how he's pushing the pieces together to help me find the wholeness that we're all looking for and to move towards that meaning. And that's how it links to inspiration, because it creates a kind of way more, I think for me, it's made me much more sensitized to the ways in which he does that, to the dreams that I have, to the first comments that someone sends me, to maybe the Bible reading that I read the next morning. All of these are potential non-causal events that could seem random, but if I'm awake to them, if I'm being sensitive to the synchronicity of them, they can help to bring meaning. So that's what synchronicity is.
I think
that's how it links.
I think that's amazing. And a few thoughts jump to mind as you're saying. The one is that it creates a natural filter as well. Like I said, we are easily inspired.
We segue.
Yes. So when you have this sense of over time, because I think over time it would begin to line up like lampposts.
Absolutely.
That you can begin to say, so this inspires me at this moment.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really line up to any of the lampposts. So I'm probably going to put that on the shelf for now.
Yeah.
But I'm going to...
Something might come back.
Something might come back, but I'm not focusing on that for now. So I think that's one thing. It creates quite a nice filter, because that's an issue for people like us, and I think for most entrepreneurs. Definitely. In fact, I read the other day, something like 80% of entrepreneurs have ADHD. So we have this problem that we get distracted, we get inspired, we get interested. The other thing that really stood out for me was that this concept of, so I've got quite a few friends who are atheists and Muslims and Hindus, and because I was in China, more Buddhist oriented. So I often try and say, if something's really true, I think it should apply to most people should find value in it.
Yeah.
So just as you were speaking, I was thinking, if I was an unbeliever of this idea of synchronicity and meaning as such, but I still said, let me follow the same path.
Yeah.
So you kind of looking at it from a perspective of you saying, I think there is possibly a higher power that bestows meaning and gives me signals of that meaning in life. However, if you looked at it just from the other side and you just said, I'm not sure that there is such a higher power, but let me look for meaning that connects.
Absolutely.
I think you will find that in life, there are going to be things that you begin to, that enable you to live life more meaningfully and have a deeper sense of meaning. And maybe in the process, you might get to the point where you go, well, there's just too many of these. I can't stop. I can't now say that there's no higher. Maybe not. But I think that living from a place of meaning, and whether you think it's meaning that's bestowed or meaning that you discover, either way, you live a
And
richer life
isn't that
than what you would have.
that's such a great place to go to, or almost bring our discussion to conclusion, because exactly, you know, whether you're a believer or not, you start with the decision of how you're going to view reality. What's your worldview?
Yes.
And that decision is based on, is there meaning, or is it just chaotic and random? And that's a simple choice. It doesn't have to yet involve God. For us, it makes way more sense if it does. But you have a decision to, and there's two parts to that decision. First of all, is there some sort of order and design or meaning? Because that's what's implied by meaning, that there's a design. And is it good?
Yeah.
So are you going to orientate yourself to one piece of faith? And both of them require faith. Either your faith is that it's actually, there's no such thing as good and bad, all right? And that the world is chaotic and has no meaning. Well, you know, if you choose to go that route, here's some news for you. You're probably going to have a chaotic, disordered, and very unfulfilling life. But that's an option. That's one. The other worldview is to say, there's some meaning, there's some design, either first put there or something that I will discover, and it's oriented towards good. I think that second part's also amazing. If you just make that collaboration choice, that makes all the difference. And that's the choice everybody has. Now, once you make the choice that we're saying is the best one to make, then obviously there are questions that follow after that. But exactly, and I mean, even to answer that question for any atheist, is that, you know, Carl Jung he's writing psychology books, etc. So he's not jumping straight out of the bandwagon and saying, well, that collective intelligence is the God of the Bible. He doesn't do that. He even suggests this idea, which even if this is the first step you need to go to, is what he calls the collective unconscious, which is joining things together. In other words, I mean, this isn't so arrogant to think about this. You're born with a brain. All right, that brain's got a whole bunch of existing neural pathways. Where did they come from, Ruchi? Well, they came from, if you understand evolution, from generations and generations of Ashton's ancestors who lived life. And that got into their body, that got into their genes.
The very design.
Yeah. So what you have is you have your conscious, what you've grabbed from your brain that you're using, but there's a whole bunch of collective, all your ancestors' experiences and learnings, etc., that are actually designed into your brain right now. That's one of the things that we believe is happening when you're dreaming. And so what happens is you are also being able to tap into some of that collective unconsciousness. That's the world's greater intelligent design that's made available to you. But all of this requires a little bit of a spirit of humility. To say, we don't just live in this deterministic world where I can work out everything and get all the logic. You open yourself up. Coming back to inspiration only works if you're prepared to open yourself up. If you're closed, if you have a negative view of the world, if you view the world as actually essentially evil, then you're not open to be inspired, because everything's firmly shut up.
Yeah.
But it's that spirit of humility and together with a bit of patience. I've had to learn that. You talk about things that entrepreneurs aren't that good with. I mean, a good thing about entrepreneurs, they're a doer. Let's make things happen. Yeah. But at the same time, if you're going to be inspired, you have to be a bit patient sometimes. You have to say, I'm going there, but I'm seeing that I might have to go there to there to there to there, and I'll still end up there. And
exactly.
Hopefully these podcasts, we can talk about some of the journeys where I ended up exactly where I wanted to be, the 50,000 people in the Sea Point Stadium. But my word, the journey was nowhere near I expected to be going.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many business people we could talk to and sit in this room who would tell us exactly the same. And that's both encouraging for people, because don't think just because the journey seems to have gone left and you were trying to go north and you're now going east for a while, or west, whichever direction that is, that's wrong. You know, keep your eye on the goal, but allow yourself to be inspired and move a little along the way.
Exactly. I remember that, and we can maybe close off with that because I think it brings all of this together a lot in terms of inspiration, freedom, meaning, synchronicity, which is one of the things you and I discussed, I don't know, I think like 20 years ago, which was that you need to have a long-term goal.
Yeah.
And you need to plan for the short term. But the medium term, there's no way of telling.
We used to call it that, exactly. So you're right. We used to say the space. That's where the space is. That's where that. Exactly. I think we used to also say that because you would have your short-term things you've got to do in the next 3 months, and then we would have the vision,
the 5
and then we put the strategy, but we keep them loose enough.
Yeah.
Because you suddenly think, oh, that strategy wasn't so great. Be prepared to throw that one off and then move towards that direction.
Absolutely, and that's how we grow, and that's how inspiration takes us.
Well, this has been. Thank you very much, inspiring, buddy. We did it. We did our first one.
Yes.
Yes.